Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. And Andy Bottoms is here. When I asked Andy to come on the show, I was hoping we were going to break down the potential locations that Indiana could be sent for the tournament, and maybe talk about, are they going to be a 6 or a 7 seed? And a lot has changed since I invited Andy on the show, and Indiana is in the midst of a 4-game losing streak. They go to Ohio State on Monday. Things are not looking so great. Andy, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. I wish we were on a more positive note with IU basketball, but as we talked a little bit before we hit record, it seems like we're back in the same spot once again.
Yeah, we're in familiar territory, and I keep thinking that for every year that I've done bracketology for Inside the Hall, that one of these years we'll have a positive conversation to have about IU, and every year I feel like we end up in about the same place in February.
Yeah, so pretty loaded question here to start, but I'll just kind of let you open with your thoughts on how we got here in this season with Indiana. It seemed like, I think at one point they were, was it 16-5? They looked like they were headed in the right direction, and then now obviously it's been a tough stretch of games. I think the Northwestern game obviously complicated some things from just a team chemistry standpoint, having guys suspended, and also just losing that game in general. I think really put Indiana in a unfavorable spot. But what's just kind of been your thoughts on this last couple of weeks and how Indiana got back in this position once again?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I feel like I think it starts from the offensive struggles. Quite honestly, for as much as everybody lamented what the offense looked like under Archie Miller, and we on the assembly call were certainly among the chorus of people wondering why the offense can't be more successful, why Cavs can't make shots. It's actually worse. Under Woodson, they're next to last in offensive efficiency in Big Ten play, outside of the top 100 in the country, and for all the strides that they made defensively, which has been really impressive, and I think in some ways has really been overshadowed by how rough the offense has been. They just aren't able to make plays down the stretch, and then I think all the past challenges creep in to the minds of the guys that were here. And something that we talked about on Assembly Call Radio last night that I brought up, and Gary Parrish had initially brought it up with Texas, but I think it's somewhat applicable to IU. You bring in a bunch of transfers, but they weren't coming from places that they were, as a team, successful. And so his example with Texas was, you bring Marcus Carr from Minnesota, and you bring Trey Mitchell from UMass, and you have guys who put up numbers, did show themselves to be reasonably good players, in some cases great players, but they weren't really successful and kind of lacked that, learning how to win in some of these games. I think you see the same thing with IU. IU has a team full of guys that came back who have not performed well during these pressure situations in the last couple seasons. And you brought in other guys who you asked them to play key roles who haven't even been in those pressure situations in terms of playing for a tournament berth and those kinds of things. And, Xavier Johnson and Miller Kopp, even Parker Stewart, even though he's been here, he hasn't been at teams that have been, in that mix. Michael Durr or South Florida hasn't been, so you look at all that stuff and maybe we should be less surprised than we are. But I still think that, the talent on the roster probably suggests they should be better than what they've been of late, but I do think you can look at it and kind of find some reasons to say, maybe this looks a lot like the last few years, because you have a lot of the same guys who were here the last few years and a lot of guys from other programs who have not really proven the ability to get it over the hump in some of these tight games.
Your comments about the transfers are interesting because it's something I've been thinking about a lot the last couple of weeks. Just in general, building a program through the transfer portal. I know it's going to be an important part of the plan for every program moving forward, because it's basically like a one-time free agency for each player that goes into the portal. But the more I think about it, you have, in most cases, now there are some exceptions with a team like Kentucky this year getting Oscar Sheboy from West Virginia, Kellen Grady from Davidson. Obviously, those are players that can really help you win. But in most cases, when you look at the guys that transfer, they fall into a couple of categories. Usually it's a transfer up from a lower level, and you don't necessarily know how that's going to work. Or you have guys who are in maybe not the greatest of situations, trying to get away from that situation and come to a place where they can find more success. So I'm curious just for your thoughts on the sustainability in general of building a program through the transfer portal. I was one of the people who thought maybe a year ago this was going to be a thing on an annual basis where Indiana might have to dip into the portal and get a couple guys every year. And I'm starting to wonder, just based on the success rate with this particular team, you look at Xavier Johnson, Michael Durr, Miller Kopp, Parker Stewart. Really, besides Johnson, it's been a 25% hit rate, I'd say, in terms of getting great productive play out of the transfer portal, and Johnson hasn't even done that consistently. So with the portal in general, do you think maybe it's not going to be the solution that some of us thought it was going to be moving forward in college basketball?
I think it depends a lot. And I'm trying to think of good examples of this, but I think when you can bring transfers into a program that really has an established culture that they can buy into, and everything around them kind of points toward, that culture. This is how we do things. And that, I think it can be a lot more successful. IU's not in that position right now, and hasn't been, quite honestly, for, last handful of years. So I think there's things that can make the landing spots for transfers more successful. I think what typically has not been successful is just going and grabbing a whole bunch of guys and then trying to, just think that, hey, this guy played well here, he's going to be able to play well in this other situation. And there is something to be said for that cohesiveness with having a core group of guys year over year. I think if you look at that in the Big Ten, that by and large checks out with where people are. I mean, Purdue hasn't really dipped into the transfer portal a great deal, so I don't bring them up as that example, but I think the culture example fits well there. The core group of guys fits well there. And even as they bring in, talented guys, there's an established way of how we go about things as a program. And you see that from Wisconsin. Yeah, they've got Johnny Davis, who's an unbelievable player and has taken a huge leap this year. But, I think culture is one thing that you would say immediately about that program. Michigan State, kind of the same way. I think Illinois is getting there. And that's, maybe another good example. They bring in Plummer, who had been a solid player, but he was kind of asked to come in and play a role, and they had a fairly established, hierarchy of guys. You got Kofi, you've got Frazier, and he was able to just kind of slot in and do a job within the framework of how they already operated, as opposed to, trying to establish that culture and bring in these guys at the same time when it's really not there with so many holdovers. I think maybe that leads to a little bit of the struggles that IU's had, but I do think you're going to find, it's the hit rate on a lot of these is not great across college basketball. And I don't know that says that guys shouldn't have transferred or shouldn't have done that, but I think it speaks a little bit to the difficulty of, at that age, putting yourself in a different situation and trying to figure out how you fit in to whatever that is. And I kind of go back to the ones who can paint a clearer picture of this is how we do things and here's where you fit in, are going to be a little bit easier for those guys to integrate into rosters maybe than what IU has had to try to deal with at the same time.
Our friends at Homefield produce the world's most comfortable premium licensed collegiate apparel out of their headquarters in Indianapolis. Run by IU grads, Homefield studies Indiana's history to come up with the most unique apparel designs available for Hoosier fans anywhere. Our current favorites at Podcast on the Brink are the 1987 National Champs t-shirt commemorating IU's last national championship and the vintage 1965 Indiana University Bison t-shirt. And it's not just Indiana apparel available at Homefield. They're constantly adding new schools to the over 120 currently available at homefieldapparel.com. Podcast on the Brink listeners can save 15% off of your first purchase by using code BRINK15 during checkout at homefieldapparel.com. You could even look at the three guys that left Indiana this past year in the transfer portal. I mean, they've obviously Al Durham went to a situation at Providence where he's having a lot of team success, but numbers wise and efficiency, he's taken a dip. Jerome Hunter's basically at this point at Xavier, barely playing in some games. So he hasn't really changed all that much in terms of his production. And Armand Franklin obviously went to Virginia, a program that does have a winning culture built up, and his 3-point shooting, I think, is worse than what it's been and has been a bit of a disappointment there. So I just wonder, and I don't want to turn the transfer portal into the whole podcast, but I just wonder with Indiana specific situation, how much it's going to be able to help. If you're not going to be, obviously you take a guy like Oscar Sheba if you can get him out of the portal because he's an impact player. But if you're reaching for guys from lower levels or from programs that are not as established and you're just looking to kind of fill holes that way, I don't necessarily think it's going to be the best long-term fit. I wanted to get into some questions in the Inside the Hall community. I opened it up. It's always interesting to do this, Andy. So prepare yourself for a fun line of questioning. Got some good questions. Just wanted to go through a couple of these quickly. Colby is asking, how many more wins do you think Indiana needs to get in the dance? I've been asked this question. I think we talked about this a little bit before we hit record, but the floor is yours, Andy. What's the magic number at this point for Indiana to get in, or is there even a magic number at this point?
Yeah, I saw that you put out a call for questions. I held out from one, putting some softballs in there for myself, and two, reading what other people put. So you'll get my unvarnished answers here when we talk through it. So I think probably the easiest place to start with this one is just a quick overview of where IU's resume stands at this point. So they're 2-6 in quad one with wins over Purdue and Ohio State. Really 5 of those losses are to teams that are in the tournament field right now. Iowa's trending a little bit the wrong direction, but the one that kind of stands out there is the Northwestern game. We obviously all know the circumstances around that one. Quad two, they're just 2-3. That Notre Dame win, I think, looks a lot better than what anybody would have expected at the beginning of the season. The other win that falls in there is the win at Maryland. And here's where some of the losses that, even though they aren't, I think a lot of times bad losses get framed up as quad 3 or quad 4 losses. The other thing that I look at, and I know in talking to other bracketologists look at as well, is like, how did you do against teams that are in the field? And that's where, 2 of IU's losses that fall in quad 2 are against teams that are not in the discussion for an at-large in Syracuse and Penn State. So even though technically they're not quote-unquote bad losses, they're also losses against teams not in the field. And then the Michigan loss at home remains to be seen where Michigan shakes out in the grand scheme of things. They've been a little bit up and down. Got a nice win at Iowa last night. Probably be in as of today. I haven't quite finished looking at things, but and then anything after that really doesn't mean anything, other than the fact that you don't have any losses. But right now I use 8 and 9 against the first 3 quadrants because 8 of the wins fall in quad 4. That speaks to the strength of schedule, which doesn't help you. They're 318th, I think, as of this morning, which is not very good. Sometimes you can offset that by winning, more games away from home. IU's got 2 true road wins. And so that I'll spin that forward into the remaining games. So if you look at what they've got left, you've got at Ohio State, at Purdue, both those are quad 1 opportunities. You've got at Minnesota and Rutgers at home, which are the quad 2 games, and then Maryland at home is a quad 3 right now. So I don't think you can suffer another loss to a team that's not even in the mix. So I think you have to win at Minnesota. You have to win at Maryland. That's 2. Don't think you can drop a quad 2 game to Rutgers at home. I think that win would actually carry some weight based on how Rutgers is playing right now. So that takes you to 3. I am of the opinion that, and I'll preface this by saying it's not just what you do, it's what other teams around you do. And so IU, in theory, this week has been helped by Oregon losing a couple games and SMU losing at Temple. And so some other teams around there have lost, which is, technically helped IU and probably helped them stay in the projected field for the time being. But I'm not so sure that you don't need to end up 4-1 in that scenario, because that does a couple things. It gives you 2 more road wins, which I think would be huge for this team. Gives you another quad 1 win, and you build up a little bit of what you've got in, you then have a winning record in quad 2. And so I think that helps. So I feel like you have to get the quad 2 and quad 3 games. You can make an argument if you lose both the quad 1 games, then maybe you do something in the Big Ten tournament, which everybody probably just snickering as I said that as we talk about it. So I think 3-2 is absolute minimum, but I think 4-1 would make you feel a little bit better, because the challenge they have right now is they've got 3 wins against teams in the field, and they've lost most of the other games against teams that they've played that would be in the field. And that just, for some teams around the cut line, using Rutgers as the example, Rutgers' net rating and some of their other metrics don't look as good at IU's, but you've got 6 quad 1 wins, which is 3 times as many as IU has. At some point, that stuff matters. And Lucas Harkins, who's one of the other guys who's doing the Fielding the 68 show that I've been on a couple times, he wrote a really good piece this week. I'll try to retweet it today because I think he just updated it. But talks a little bit about how the committee has used the net. We've only got 2 years of history, so it isn't a lot, but how they've used the net. And what it mentions is that typically the seeding tends to skew maybe a little bit more toward some of the predictive metrics, but the bubble teams and the selections of the last few teams tend to skew a bit more toward the resume metrics. So if you think about KPI, strength of record, and when you look at IU, they rank worse in those than they do in the quote unquote quality metrics like the Ken Palms and BPI and things like that. So I think if you get some of those wins, though, you bolster your resume case, and maybe that helps you get in the end. So I'd say 3-2 minimum, plus you probably got to win one in the Big Ten tournament. And then I think 4-1, you'd probably feel pretty good at that point heading into the Big Ten tournament, at least as good as an IU fan could feel heading into that.
This isn't a question from the community, but it just popped into my head. So Indiana probably at minimum has to get 3 wins, but first they need to get 1 win and stop this losing streak. Do you have any level of confidence that this team is going to have the leadership in the locker room, on the sidelines, just the cohesiveness as a group that it takes to dig out of this hole? Because I don't think most people are not going to expect them to go into Ohio State and win on Monday, which I don't want to call it a loss before the game's even played. That's why you play the games, but it's an uphill battle. So at that point, let's say they don't win that game. Do you have any confidence that they're going to be able to win 3 in a row in terms of just having the leadership in the locker room to turn that around?
Yeah, I think that's the hard part to sit here, and it, for me, from a bracketology perspective, is a little bit unique in that I watch a good amount of other games, but I'll see a few games of some of these other bubble teams. And what I find myself doing with IU, since I'm watching all of them and talking about them on the show and all those kinds of things, is like you're very much more, and I try to remove myself from it, but I think in general I tend to be harder on IU maybe than other people who are looking at it would be, because you're a little bit too close to it and have seen it a little bit too much. And I think I find myself kind of skewing to the negative side of things, because having watched this team play, there's very little that we've seen recently, even though they've been close in some of the games and had good moments in some of the games. It's hard to look at how they're playing now, how they've played in similar situations in recent years, and have the confidence level to say they're going to be able to turn that around. Do I think they have the ability to do that? Absolutely. But it also is hard to predict that with any level of confidence right now, just based on what we've seen.
I got some non-bracketology related questions, but some of these I felt were interesting. So this is a pretty open-ended one, and you can take it in whatever direction you want. But Parker asks where you see the future of Indiana basketball with Woodson at the helm, and will the bubble team woes end anytime soon?
Yeah, we had a fairly lengthy discussion on the show last night, and by fairly, I mean really lengthy discussion on the show last night, just in terms of the amount of patience that people should have with Woodson. And where I kind of came down, the Cliff Notes version of my thoughts on it are that I think people probably did, and certainly feel like they gave Archie too much time and saw red flags, but kind of said, hey, this will work out, give it time. We need to be patient. And I think now, in a lot of cases, what we're seeing from a reaction on the show and different things like that is the opposite reaction. I likened it to you're going off the road and then you jerk the wheel to try to get it, kind of course correct and get it back on. So I think it's going a little bit too far in the other direction. I think what you're seeing from a recruiting standpoint suggests one wants it to really be guard heavy, guard dependent. And I'm not sure that right now, and I've been a pretty big Xavier Johnson defender over the course of the season. I don't think he has the depth at that position to really run what he wants to run. And what you also don't see a ton of is recruiting a guy like Trace Jackson Davis, who is a more traditional back to the basket big guy, all those kinds of things. That doesn't mean Trace Jackson Davis isn't good. I think it suggests, though, that probably isn't how he wants the way they're playing this year. Maybe this is me hoping isn't how they want to play. And he's trying to figure it out in the short term. I think what gives me some pause and what are potential red flags for me that I think are reasonable for people to be a little bit upset by or frustrated with is some of the in-game stuff, whether that be substitutions, other adjustments schematically, even game to game, what's really improved, especially with the offense as we go. Because I think when we came into the season, I think that's one part that everybody said, look, this guy, I cited, a tweet from Fran Fraschilla last night. These guys, don't worry about somebody coming from the NBA. They know all these sets. They know blah, 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 blah. And I think what we would have expected to be really good was the offense, and that, somebody coming from the NBA is going to be able to turn that part around pretty quickly. And that hasn't happened. Now the defense has probably been better than what I thought it would be. So I think there's enough things that you've seen defensively. I think some of the cultural stuff hopefully pays dividends, to go back to our prior discussion. And I think the recruiting has generally been good. Now, at some point, not making the tournament this year is certainly not ideal. I don't think it's the end of the world either, but I do think you get to next year and you're not able to get to that point. I think that becomes a lot more concerning. I'd be a lot more concerned if the same thing happened next year than I guess I am right now. And so, I think you've seen enough in certain areas to say, yeah, things are moving in the right direction, but I also don't blame anybody and would actually be concerned if people didn't have some questions after what they've seen on the offensive end in particular, and again, in some of the in-game stuff this year. So I don't know that totally answers the question. I don't think I guess I say all that to say, I don't think it's as bad as it probably feels right now, losing 4 games. But you can't ignore some of the red flags either at this point.
This next question kind of ties in a little bit to what you spoke of with the offense, because one thing that has become clear to me as Indiana's gotten to the tougher part of its schedule is just the talent at the guard positions, the wing positions, and how one-dimensional some of these guys are. And it kind of reminds me in a way of going back to some of those seasons where you had Justin Smith playing for Indiana, and Indiana became so predictable to guard because you could guard them one way and find success. And I feel like in many ways teams have figured that out, and they've adjusted the way that they're going to approach playing Indiana. So Tom Jameson wants to know what your thoughts are on the talent at IU, and his comment is he thinks Indiana is very limited on talent, and it doesn't really seem to be the right mix, if that makes any sense. Any comments on that perspective, and maybe how the talent and what he's trying to do offensively maybe doesn't mesh particularly well?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I know we've had some conversations on the show in terms of what the overall assessment of the talent is. I think some of us differ in terms of what that looks like. I do think you have some guys who are a bit more one-dimensional. I know Jared's talked about this a lot and shared some of the data online. The lineups with Miller Kopp and Parker Stewart in them, I think were initially designed to say, hey, these guys give us the ability to space the floor. The challenge is nobody's really breaking anybody down to create shots for those guys. And too many times there's not enough movement to really get them shots. So I would agree. I think there is, I mean, when you look at the overall talent on the roster, it probably is a middle of the road, Big Ten team in that regard. I would also say on the flip side of that, I'm not sure the scheme has allowed them to maximize the talent that they do have, and the way they've been deployed has not allowed them to maximize the talent. And that's something that I've, kind of harped on over the last couple of weeks on the show, because I'll use one of the plays that Ryan broke down on film session yesterday, and I forget whether it was, what number 1 through 5 it was, but there's one of the plays where the ball goes inside and it gets kicked back out to Trey Galloway on the wing, who kind of shot fakes, but clearly doesn't want to take the shot. It wasn't the one that he shot late in the game. And I just found myself thinking, if that's Parker Stewart catching that pass, one, either the guy didn't help off of him so much, or two, that's a shot that you'd love to get in the flow of the offense. And so I look at stuff like that, and that's where I'm thinking, could there be other... I feel like there's other ways to better utilize the talent. And somebody commented in the chat on our show the other night that while I was saying similar things, they're like, the sum, the sum is greater than the parts. In this case, it feels like the sum is less than the parts, more often than not, where just not able to deploy guys in a way that helps them do that. But I do think overall, just creation ability from the guard position is something that Woodson really seems to value. Again, I'm saying that based a little bit more off of recruiting and those kinds of guys. And that's something that basically one guy has, maybe 1.5 if you throw Trey Galloway into that. So I do think that's a case where the talent isn't necessarily suited to do what he might ultimately want to do, but it's also your job as the coach to figure out how to work around that in the interim until you get the guys in who you think can.
Yeah, it kind of feels like to me that he had a plan for what he wanted to do, and it worked to an extent to get them to a certain point of the season, that record where it felt like, if they would have beat Illinois in that home game, they probably were headed for the top 25 poll, and now the bottom's kind of fallen out. And it doesn't seem like anything's changed in terms of the approach. And I think that's kind of where you make a good point, where people can still be enthused about Mike Woodson as the coach and excited about the future, but I also think it's healthy for any fan base or anybody who covers a team. I'm a White Sox fan, and I watch a ton of games, and anytime there's a move made, I'm thinking in my head, like, is this the right move by the manager or things like that? So I think there's, in some ways, like, there's some fans, and I've noticed that don't want any critical discourse or any discussion of what the coach does. And then there's other people who kind of take it too far another way. I think there's like a healthy medium in the middle where you can kind of evaluate the situation. And in this situation specifically, I agree with you. I just don't necessarily know that the plan that was working earlier in the season is going to work here down the stretch, and some things probably need to be different. I guess the argument from Woodson's standpoint would be, well, he changed the starting lineup, but I do agree with you. Some of the shots that they got late in the game, while they were open, are those necessarily the guys you want taking that particular shot? And I think it's up to the coach to put the players in the best position to get the shots they can make.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, the other thing that hasn't been talked about a lot, we got a question about this last night, is, and I don't say this necessarily from a shot making standpoint, but I do think the loss of Rob Finney has contributed to some of that. And we can point to the Purdue game and say, yeah, well, there is shot making there. And I think he was becoming, at the very least, a lot more confident in stepping into shots and a lot less hesitant to take some shots that, maybe if he's given those shots in the Wisconsin game, he's maybe more willing to step up and take them than other guys. There's also enough of a track record to say you don't know that he would make that shot. He's had some, his offensive efficiency numbers by and large outside of that game have not been great. I think he helps you from a defensive standpoint, and I think that's just forced, some guys to take on bigger roles that may not be a great fit for in certain situations, or his place forces Avery Johnson to play more minutes. And I think what you saw a lot late in the Wisconsin game is a lot of jump shots from a lot of guys with really tired legs based on how they had been used. And when you already have a team that doesn't shoot the ball all that well, throw in the fatigue factor of how many minutes a lot of those guys had played, I think that contributes a little bit to the the lack of the shots going in as well. And I think that at least is an area where, maybe Rob helps, not necessarily in the shot making standpoint, but our guy's a little bit fresher down the stretch. Certainly can make arguments about what he could have done defensively potentially. But I think that's maybe been a bigger loss than people would have expected for a few different reasons.
Should have researched this next question before we came on. You may know off the top of your head. I was just trying to think through it the last 10 seconds here. But Wine Country Mark asks, will any teams with a former NBA coach or player as their head coach make the tournament this year? I'm thinking Juwan Howard is a potential one if Michigan makes it. Who else would be? Obviously, it doesn't seem like Tony Bennett and Virginia are going to the tournament.
Yeah, I'm trying to do a quick scan down the list here. I don't think there's too many. Now, maybe there's some in
Memphis is in the mix, right? Maybe.
Yeah, they're in the mix right now. So they would be another one. Trying to even think if there's any of the
is Mark Pope's the head coach, right? Was he at BYU? Are they in the
I think they're right around the cut line right now. I don't know if Hubert Davis played did he play in the NBA? I don't know.
I don't know.
And then I was trying to think if there was any of the, teams that from leagues that will typically have, just the automatic qualifier will get in. None really jump to mind. I do think it's relatively.
None are prominent in terms of the, a top four seed. Or like that.
Yeah. None of them would be safely in at this point. Anybody we can come up with is not right there for sure.
Okay. Jane Jackson wants to know, what are your thoughts on Trace staying an additional year? Would it be better for Indiana if he goes or if he stays? If he stays, how would it affect the team or how would it affect the team next year? I've got thoughts on this, but Andy, you can chime in first.
I guess I don't know. I'm not sure what he gets out of coming back at this point. I struggle a little bit to really understand. And unfortunately, I feel like I'm saying some of the same stuff I said last night. But Jared and I talked about this a little bit. It seems fairly clear based on some of Woodson's comments that he has no issue with Trey stepping out and taking shots in the same way that Race Thompson has stepped out and taken more threes and done some of that. It doesn't seem like it is a situation where he's not, quote unquote, allowed to do that. But he isn't. And the reason almost doesn't matter as to why, because the options are essentially he's not confident enough to do it. He doesn't feel like he's been effective enough in it to do it, or he hasn't worked on it enough to do it. I tend to think it's not the last one. And I do think to a certain extent, it's just a confidence thing. So at the point when you're not comfortable doing it, I don't know what happens in the offseason that makes him, other than more reps and things like that, more comfortable doing it. I think there's been arguments to be made. I'd say this with anybody coming back. Coming back another year gives scouts and everybody else a year's worth of time to poke holes in your game and find the things that you can't do and highlight those maybe a little bit more than the things that you can do. And I think at this point, he's kind of had enough holes poked in his game that I just don't know what the benefit is from his perspective. And I think from an IU perspective, I don't know, like I said earlier, I don't know that that's the kind of, thing that Woodson wants to really build around in terms of a back to the basket post guy who's a little bit undersized, quite honestly, for at least some of the other guys in the Big Ten. Maybe other leagues, that's not, you wouldn't necessarily say that. Like, the Big East, he's probably not undersized. But in the Big Ten, given some of the other guys, he is. So I don't know. I think it probably ends up being a moot point. I think he leaves regardless. And I think that probably is best for everybody involved. And like I said, I don't say that as a commentary on him, but I just don't know that there's anything to really be gained for him by coming back. And that's kind of where my answer largely lies.
Yeah, the 3-point shooting thing is interesting. I've talked to Ryan Krause a little bit about this, just kind of, and we talk about the team all the time, and it's a little bit head scratching to me because you look at a guy like Luka Garza who came into Iowa, obviously a little bit more skilled than Trace, just in terms of what he can do with the ball, but he wasn't, I don't think, shooting a high volume of 3-pointers early in his career. And by the time he got done. It was something that was a big part of his game. And Hunter Dickinson's another example at Michigan, who as a recruit, he didn't look at Hunter Dickinson as a guy that was going to take a lot of threes, but this year he's been able to step out and do it. So I agree with you that it's got to be an issue of it's something that Trace just doesn't feel comfortable doing. We have obviously no insight or idea into what he works on in the off season, how much extra time he goes into the gym. He's also remained just kind of an average free throw shooter, which is something that is a little bit puzzling, just based on the fact that, you know, most of his opportunities are going to be around the rim. He's going to get fouled a lot, and it could be the difference between wins and losses if he was a much better free throw shooter. But I think he's somewhere in the high 60s percentage wise, which is not, you know, terrible, but it's also something I feel like as a player, that's something that you can really, it's just about reps and getting better and more confident at. So in terms of how it impacts Indiana basketball, whether or not he comes back, I also agree with you, Andy, that, you know, it almost feels like a fresh start could be the best thing for everybody involved. The caveat there is you start looking ahead to next season in terms of the front court, and you wonder where the production is going to come from. You don't know what's going to happen with Race Thompson. Obviously, I think most of these guys could come back. Michael Durr, I just don't see as anything more than a 9th or 10th guy on a Big Ten roster. Logan Duncombe is not a guy who's shown much of anything this year. Jordan Geronimo is, not a center. He's obviously a guy that can play the four, but so then you kind of wonder what is going to happen at that position if Trace is gone. So it's obviously you'd love to have the production back if you wanted to come back. And the one thing that kind of gives me pause in terms of wondering what he'll do is there an NIL component of this where he's going to be able to do better financially by staying in school than going and playing in what would probably be, a two-way contract with the G League? I just don't see him as necessarily a guy that's going to get picked and have a solid NBA contract. So that there's a lot to unpack here, but it's, in some ways I just wonder if Indiana is better off with, and Trace too, kind of getting a fresh start and moving on and kind of trying to move to the next chapter. But I do think it is a bit scary, the prospect of, if Trace and Race are both gone, where does this team turn for points next season?
Yeah, things get thin up front in a hurry in that scenario, as you mentioned. So I do think that's the other part of it that I think that really puts you in a position where you really got to go in the transfer portal. It circles back to our other discussion of like how effective can you really be? Are you, it's kind of like making late round picks in the NFL draft. There's some teams that seem really good at it and find guys who fit, and there's some teams that aren't. You got to be one who really is able to find a big guy in that scenario who fits well with what you want to do and is going to accept the role that you need and different things like that. But I do think there's an inherent challenge in having a team that's centered around a guy who really can't create his own shot. But I think given his ability, you feel like you have to run a lot of the offense around him. And I think sometimes that has, unintended, potentially negative consequences to other guys where they're just apt to stand around and kind of wait for him to do something. That's what we've seen so much these last couple of years. And I think you saw it a little bit late in that game against Wisconsin. And Wisconsin is basically daring anybody else to, to make another shot, to make a shot, as Ryan pointed out in the, in the videos yesterday. So it'll be interesting offseason, as it always seems to be with IU.
Last thing before we go, I wanted to ask you about the three other Big Ten bubble teams at this point. I think there's three: Rutgers, Michigan, and Iowa. I mean, I don't know if you consider Iowa a bubble team at this point, but I know Rutgers and Michigan are certainly considered on the bubble. Where are each of those three teams right now in your mind? I know you won't have a new bracket out until Tuesday of next week, but I'm just kind of curious for your thoughts on those three teams and their chances to actually get in the field.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Iowa is a team that I have been a bit lower on, it seems like, compared to other folks as well. What really props them up, to go back to one of the other things I brought up earlier, is like their average quality metrics are really good. So the BPI, the KenPom, the Sagarin, and part of that is because they just blew the doors off of some people in the non-conference, and that stuff helps in those metrics. But they're a little bit like IU, maybe even a more pronounced version of IU, just in terms of lack of quality wins. So as of this morning, they're 0-6 in quad 1 games. They've got a couple quad 2 losses. But if you look at their best wins, it's IU at home, it's Utah State on a neutral floor, at Virginia, at Maryland, at Minnesota. Those are their quad 1 and quad 2 wins. So it kind of becomes a question of how much weight do those metrics really carry? Because their resume metrics are not very good. Yet they are, I think, the one of the three that you mentioned that is kind of considered the safest at this point. Rutgers would qualify as the most intriguing. They had a really, really bad week in November or December, and I think 3 of their 4, or maybe all 3 of their worst losses came in that week, to Lafayette at home, at UMass, and at DePaul. Were all very close to one another in terms of how they happened. But, if you think about what their resume looks like, they got wins over Purdue and Illinois and Ohio State, Iowa, Michigan at home. And what had typically been, and even a couple years ago when they were trying to get in, one of the knocks against them was lack of wins away from home. And they don't have a ton of those wins away from home. They're 3-7 in road games, but they did win at Wisconsin, and that holds a ton of weight. So if you look at them, they probably would be the safest at this point. And I think sometimes everybody gets so hung up on, oh, this is a bad loss or this is whatever. You also have to beat people. And whereas Iowa has kind of avoided some of the really bad losses that a Rutgers would have, Rutgers probably has 3 or 4 losses that are worse than any losses that Iowa has. Rutgers also has probably 6 wins that are better than anything that Iowa has. So those two are kind of an interesting contrast. Rutgers falls a little bit like IU. Their non-conference strength of schedule is just outside 300, although Iowa's is getting pretty close, to be honest. So I'd probably have, like I said, I haven't quite looked at it, but I think Rutgers, it's hard to leave them out at this point. And then Michigan's, they're kind of like a hybrid between the two of the others, where if you look at, some of the metrics, they're not as good in the quality metrics as Iowa, but they're not as bad as Rutgers, because they didn't take on some of those. They took some not so great losses, but not terrible. They don't have 6 quad 1 wins, but they do have 3. They're 6-9 against the top 2 quadrants. They've only got 1 quad 3 loss. So they're kind of like a middle ground, I would say. Winning at Iowa was helpful for them last night. They won at IU, as we all are painfully aware, and then beating Purdue at home, San Diego State at home. That one helps for bubble purposes. They just had some real struggles early in the season, but they seem to have rebounded from that a little bit. So they're probably closer to the cut line than a Rutgers would be at this point. But they like I said, they're kind of a weird middle ground between the 3. So I don't know that all 3 of them make it in the long run. And if you kind of throw IU in that mix, I definitely don't think all 4 of them make it. I just probably doesn't seem realistic for the Big Ten to get 9. But I think it's conceivable that, 3 of those 4 would get in. And what Iowa really needs at this point is to go out and really prove they can beat tournament teams. They're a little bit like North Carolina light, if you will, in terms of haven't won a quad 1 game, have got some good metrics and things like that. But Iowa's got chances coming up. They still got Ohio State, Michigan, and Illinois. Now their issue is that 3 of those 4 are away from home, so that may not end well for them as they go through that. They got 4 of their last 6 on the road, so they could easily play their way out in a way similar to what IU seems to be determined to do.
Another year of Indiana basketball on the bubble is here. We hoped to avoid it and to have a March to look forward to. It seems like we're heading in the opposite direction, but Andy, you're always here to break it down for us. I know IU fans really appreciate all the work that you do on the assembly call and on Bracketology every week. I look forward to your emails on Tuesday morning when you tell me the bracket's ready to edit. I try to get in there as quick as possible and look where Indiana is. Hopefully they'll still be in on Tuesday, but who knows what's going to happen Monday night against Ohio State. Andy, thanks for the time.
Hey, appreciate you having me as always, and appreciate all that you guys do as well on Inside the Hall. And I don't just reference the film session just to get in good with you. I do look at it, and I think it always points out some interesting things in the game. So appreciate all you guys do as well.
Ryan does a great job with those, and we'll be back next week at some point with another episode of Podcast on the Brink. Not quite sure on the timing yet. Indiana obviously playing next Monday night on President's Day at Ohio State, and then they'll return home on Thursday to host Maryland. Every game from here on out is important for Indiana, and we'll be covering every step of the way on Inside the Hall. Make sure you check out the Assembly Call for post-game shows after every IU game. Thanks everybody listening, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.